You know the baby boomers, you know Generation X, you definitely know the millennials, but there is another generation, just as large, just as influential, that history almost never names. If you were born between 1954 and 1965, you've likely lived with a strange, persistent feeling. You were always there, yet rarely recognized. Old enough to remember the analog world in full detail. Young enough to build the digital one. Present at every major transition of the modern era, and yet somehow folded into someone else's story. Demographically, Generation Jones sits at the center of power in the United States today. Many of the CEOs, policymakers, and institutional leaders shaping the current world were born in this narrow window. They are not on the margins. They are not a minor cohort. They are, in many ways, the operational core of late 20th century and early 21st century leadership. And still, culturally, they remain invisible. Because they were grouped into the massive baby boomer category, their distinct psychological experience was blurred. Their formative years were different. Their economic entry point was different. Their relationship to stability, risk, and success was different. But the label never changed. Over time, that erasure leaves a mark. When your generational identity is never clearly named, your internal experience can feel strangely unconfirmed, as if you lived a history no one quite acknowledged. You weren't missing, you were misclassified. Generation Jones did not grow up without hope. In fact, they were raised inside one of the most powerful cultural promises ever constructed, the postwar American dream. The message was everywhere, in television, advertising, school guidance, and family expectations. Work hard, stay responsible, play by the rules, and a stable, prosperous adult life would follow as naturally as adulthood itself. As children in the late 1950s and 1960s, they absorbed the same imagery their older boomer siblings did. Suburban homes, secure careers, upward mobility as a norm rather than an exception. The social script seemed clear. The future was not something to fear. It was something already prepared. Their psychological foundation formed around anticipated continuity, the assumption that society would expand enough to include them comfortably when their turn arrived. But by the time Generation Jones reached adolescence and early adulthood, that expansion had stalled. The cultural atmosphere shifted from confidence to uncertainty. Political trust fractured. Economic stability weakened. The clean, predictable trajectory they had internalized as children no longer matched the world they were entering. This is where the deepest imprints formed, not simply in hardship, but in timing. They did not grow up expecting struggle. They grew up expecting stability, and then encountered volatility precisely at the moment identity and life direction solidify. Psychologically, this creates a specific kind of rupture, the loss of assumed continuity between childhood expectation and adult reality. It feels less like ordinary disappointment and more like structural disorientation. The map you were given still exists, but the terrain has changed, and so you move forward carrying two simultaneous beliefs: that life should be stable and that it may not be. Generation Jones did not just witness the end of post-war certainty. They were the first cohort raised to expect it and then required to function without it. When psychologists talk about expectation violation, they are not simply describing disappointment. They are describing a deeper rupture. What happens when the structure you trusted to organize your future suddenly fails to hold? For Generation Jones, this rupture was not abstract. It was lived at the precise age when identity, work trajectory, and adult confidence normally consolidate. They entered adulthood carrying a clear internal contract. Stability would follow effort. Security would follow responsibility. The system might demand discipline, but it would ultimately reciprocate. That belief had been rehearsed throughout childhood, in school messaging, parental advice, and the broader cultural narrative of earned prosperity. But early adult experience contradicted that contract. Secure entry-level pathways narrowed, housing costs drifted beyond reach relative to wages, long-term employment guarantees weakened. Even those who did everything correctly encountered unpredictability at the very threshold of independence. The result was not simply financial strain, it was cognitive and emotional dissonance. The sense that reality had quietly withdrawn a promise without acknowledging it had ever been made. This creates what can be called an expectation scar. Unlike overt trauma, it does not center on a single event. It forms through repeated micro-contradictions between effort and outcome, planning and instability, anticipation and delay. Over time, the psyche adapts by holding two incompatible assumptions at once. The world should reward diligence, and the world may not. That duality leaves a lasting imprint on motivation and trust. Achievement becomes urgent, not aspirational. Security becomes something to guard, not assume. And beneath competence, a subtle vigilance remains, the memory that the ground once shifted, just as adulthood began. Generational outlook often forms around what people expect from the world and what the world actually returns. Classic baby boomers came of age during expansion, when effort and reward aligned often enough to sustain broad optimism. Generation X matured inside contraction, learning early that institutions could fail and promises might not exist at all. Generation Jones stands precisely between these poles, shaped by both messages at once. They did not abandon belief in stability. They had already internalized it too deeply, but they also learned through early adult experience that stability could not be assumed. What emerged was not full cynicism and not enduring optimism, but a hybrid orientation, practical cynicism. Practical cynicism does not reject aspiration. It recalibrates trust. The desire for security, achievement, and continuity remains strong, often stronger than in cohorts that never expected them. Yet those desires are wrapped in a protective realism. Plans include contingencies. Commitments are weighed against risk. Effort carries an undertone of vigilance. Work hard, but do not presume the system will meet you halfway. This psychological stance explains much about Generation Jones' behavior in the 1980s and beyond. They pursued advancement intensely, not only for ambition, but for insulation. Career progress meant buffering against volatility they had already witnessed. Stability, once assumed, became something to construct deliberately and defend carefully. They still wanted the promise they were raised with. They simply stopped trusting that it would arrive on its own. For Generation Jones, work was never only about income. It became something more structural, a way to secure legitimacy in a world that had already shown itself to be less stable than promised. When early adulthood begins under uncertainty, achievement often shifts from aspiration to identity. Success is no longer simply desirable. It becomes proof that one has not slipped. Because the expected guarantees of adulthood weakened just as they entered the workforce, many in this cohort learned to anchor self-worth in what could still be measured and defended. Performance, reliability, advancement. Titles mattered. Professional credibility mattered. Being seen as competent, responsible, indispensable. These were not just career goals. They were psychological stabilizers. This is why Generation Jones often displays a particular form of diligence. Not flamboyant ambition, and not detached careerism, but steady, sustained investment in institutional roles. Loyalty to organizations, endurance through restructuring, willingness to shoulder responsibility. These patterns reflect more than work ethic. They reflect the conversion of achievement into safety. Underneath that conversion sits comparison pressure, unique to their position between cohorts. Older siblings often entered opportunity earlier. Younger colleagues navigated emerging sectors more fluidly. Generation Jones learned to compete in both directions at once, upward for parity, downward for relevance. Achievement became the clearest terrain where standing could still be secured. Over time, the equation deepened. If progress stalls, identity trembles. If roles dissolve, self-definition blurs. Retirement, layoffs, or plateau can therefore feel less like transitions and more like destabilizations of self. For this generation, accomplishment was never only ambition, it was continuity made visible, evidence that the promised adulthood, though delayed and harder won, had finally been secured. Generation Jones occupies a narrow but consequential position in modern history. The last cohort to complete childhood in a fully analogue world, and the first required to spend their prime working years inside the digital one. They remember rotary phones, typewriters, paper systems, and hierarchical offices, not nostalgically, but experientially. Yet, unlike many older boomers, they were still young enough and professionally exposed enough to be reshaped by computers, networks, and accelerating technological change. This dual exposure created a persistent, adaptive demand. They were expected to retain the procedural rigor of older institutional culture, while absorbing the speed and flexibility of emerging digital norms. In workplaces, families, and social systems, they became translators between eras, explaining legacy structures to younger colleagues and new tools to older ones. That role carries utility, but also weight. Bridging positions rarely confer clear belonging. To those above, Generation Jones could appear insufficiently traditional, too ready to revise established methods. To those below, they could seem like extensions of the old order, carrying analog assumptions into digital spaces. Identity feedback from both directions remained partial. Recognition was situational rather than stable. Over time, this produces what can be called bridge fatigue, the strain of continuous adaptation without full affiliation. You move fluently across contexts, yet are seldom defined by either. Competence is high, but anchoring is diffuse. Generation Jones did not merely witness a civilizational transition, they operationalized it, absorbing disruption while maintaining continuity. The burden of being the link is that the link itself is rarely centered. Intimacy for Generation Jones formed within a cultural transition. They inherited relational models from mid-century America, where commitment, provision, and endurance defined partnership, yet built their adult relationships during the economic and social volatility of the 1970s and 1980s. Love was expected to be lasting, but life had already demonstrated that stability could not be assumed. The result was a quiet recalibration of how care was expressed. Many in this cohort learned to translate love into responsibility, providing reliably, remaining present through strain, sustaining shared structures. These became primary emotional signals. Verbal vulnerability, by contrast, was less practiced. Emotional restraint was not indifference, it was containment. Feelings were carried privately to avoid adding burden to already pressured systems. Mortgages, careers, children, extended family obligations. This reserve also intersected with changing gender expectations. Men socialized into provider identity face rising economic unpredictability. Women entering expanding professional roles balanced autonomy with inherited expectations of relational maintenance. Both partners often carried silent performance pressure to secure, to stabilize, to keep the household intact despite external instability. Under such load, emotional articulation can narrow, while functional cooperation strengthens. Not surprisingly, marriages within this generation sometimes showed paradoxical patterns: durable commitment alongside muted intimacy, shared duty alongside unspoken strain. They did not love less, they loved through structure. Acts replaced declarations. Reliability replaced reassurance. For Generation Jones, partnership was less about expressive romance than mutual holding. Two individuals bracing the same uncertain world and calling that steadiness love. When Generation Jones became parents, they carried into family life the same dual imprint that shaped their adulthood. Early promise followed by instability. They had internalized the ideal of expansive possibility, yet personally experienced how quickly opportunity could narrow. Their parenting therefore fused aspiration with vigilance, a combination that profoundly shaped the childhood environment of many millennials. On one level, they encouraged self-expression and ambition more openly than prior generations. Children were told they were capable, unique, and deserving of meaningful futures. This language reflected a quiet wish that the doors which had tightened for them might open fully for their children. They wanted possibility restored across the generational line. Yet beneath that encouragement lay persistent anxiety. Having learned that security could not be assumed, Generation Jones often moved to actively engineer it for their children. Education planning began early, activities accumulated, performance signals were monitored, pathways were optimized. The message subtly expanded. You can become anything, but you must remain safe, competitive, and prepared. This transfer of vigilance was rarely conscious. It emerged from memory. Stalled careers, fragile economies, the fear of slipping behind. Children sensed both currents at once, belief and pressure, freedom and contingency. Achievement became framed not only as fulfillment, but as protection against precarity. In this way, the psychological scar of unmet expectations migrated forward. Generation Jones did not intend to burden their children, they intended to shield them. But when aspiration is fused with inherited anxiety, protection can feel like demand. The next generation inherits not only opportunity, but urgency. By midlife, many in Generation Jones had achieved what once seemed uncertain. Stable careers, leadership roles, financial footholds. They became executives, senior professionals, policymakers, institutional anchors. Outwardly, this looked like arrival, the long-delayed fulfillment of the adulthood they were raised to expect. Yet psychologically, attainment did not erase the earlier imprint of volatility. Success was experienced less as a permanent state than as a maintained position. It required vigilance. Markets could shift, industries could restructure, relevance could fade. Having entered adulthood during contraction, many never fully internalize security, even after reaching it. This creates a distinctive orientation toward power. Authority is exercised pragmatically, often competently, but rarely with complacency. Advancement is consolidated carefully. Reputation is guarded. Professional identity remains tightly coupled to continued performance. The possibility of downward mobility, once witnessed early, stays cognitively available even in stable conditions. As a result, achievement can carry a shadow, the fear of falling from what was so hard won. Leadership becomes not only influence, but insulation. Retirement decisions are delayed, roles are held longer. Transitions are weighed against loss of standing as much as gain of freedom. Generation Jones did not rise through uninterrupted expansion. They climbed through constraint. And when ascent follows uncertainty, even the summit can feel provisional, something to protect rather than simply inhabit. As Generation Jones moves into later life, a quiet psychological question often surfaces. Was it enough? Not only financially or professionally, but narratively. Did the effort, adaptation, and endurance finally resolve into the stable adulthood they were promised? Or did they simply spend a lifetime stabilizing what never fully settled? Aging can reactivate earlier themes. Retirement is not only an economic transition, it is an identity shift for a cohort that fused worth with contribution. When roles loosen, many confront an unfamiliar space, selfhood without constant function. At the same time, public discourse still tends to frame them as late boomers, leaving their distinct passage through history partially unacknowledged. Recognition arrives late, if at all. Yet there is another way to read this trajectory. Generation Jones did not fail to inherit stability. They carried continuity across rupture. They absorbed systemic change and still built institutions, families, and frameworks that others now inhabit more easily. Their story is not unfinished because it lacked achievement. It is unfinished because it has rarely been fully named. If this perspective helped you see your own life, or your parents', with more clarity, consider subscribing. And I'd genuinely like to hear your experience. What year were you born? And how did this in-between generation shape your path? Share your story in the comments. Thank you for watching.